In South America, the Atacama Desert is the most arid desert on the planet. In some places, no drop of water has fallen for 500 years. In these extreme conditions, life is limited to a strict minimum and is organized around the small amount of water available. But this hostile desert is amazingly rich in minerals, and nowadays it is attracting mankind. The mining industry and the large coastal cities have seized the precious water resources. Small communities and fragile ecosystems are the first to feel the effects. To confront this menace, scientists are mobilizing to understand water, to manage this resource, and to save the last oases. From the smallest form of life to the largest industries, everyone now finds themselves racing for water. The forested expanses of the Amazon are often the first images that come to mind when South America is evoked. However, upon this green continent, there exists a touch with the color of sand, caught between the Cordillera of the Andes and the Pacific Ocean. The Atacama Desert stretches along all the north of Chile, spilling into Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina. Although it's not the largest or the hottest desert, the Atacama Desert is considered to be the driest on the planet.
The Atacama Desert is a unique desert. It's hyper-arid. It's a desert where it doesn't rain.
In the Atacama Desert, there is no life, no vegetation, and, as a consequence, no animal life. This is the difference between it and the Sahara, where there are animals, beetles, mice, flies. In the Atacama Desert, there's nothing. This is an absolute desert, a true desert.
In the central zone, which is the driest, it never rains. This aridity has a very visible consequence. The Atacama Desert has the weakest biological activity of anywhere on the planet. Without rain, without humidity in the air or soil, it is the most hostile place for life. The central zone of the Atacama Desert is a stretch of rock and dust where nothing ever happens. Extremely dried out, Atacama has crossed the ages like this for millions of years. But on the edges of this desert can be found places more fit for life. The Atacama is bordered in the west by the Pacific coast, where several big cities can be found. In the east, it rises to the foothills of the Cordillera of the Andes, where Indian communities have taken advantage of the presence of water to found villages. This desert is the result of a geographical peculiarity. On the Pacific coast, the Humboldt Current coming up from the Antarctic cools the air and prevents the formation of clouds. On the other side, the Cordillera of the Andes, with summits over 6,000 meters, blocks the clouds and humidity coming from the Amazon basin. But is this absence of rain just a legend, or is there scientific proof? The inhabitants of Atacama, who mostly live in the big coastal cities, have to be asking this question. At the start of 2015, an exceptional rainstorm struck the region. In just 24 hours, more rain fell than usually falls in 15 years. In this arid zone where there is no vegetation, the water mixed with sand and formed deadly mudflows. The infrastructure was simply not designed for rain. When Luc Ortlieb arrived in Antofagasta in 1991, a similar rain had just fallen on the town. He became fascinated by these phenomenal and rare rains. Research director at the IRD, he works on the evolution of climate in the Atacama Desert. His mission is to reconstruct with precision what the climate was like in the past to better interpret climate changes. At the edge of the town, he found a site where he could learn more about rainfall episodes.
So here is the limit of a number of layers, which are sections of mudflows. Here there's an overlap, the oldest mudflow of this sequence. One here, one there, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, 8, 9, 10. There must be a dozen layers here, which corresponds to the last 500 years. So there's the only evidence of rain. A dozen rains in 500 years. That's the coast of the Atacama Desert.
During the very rare times when it rains on the coast, mud flows which form accumulate upon the older flows. While these accumulations give an idea of the frequency of rains, Luke wanted to know more. For his work, he needed to know the precise date when each of these episodes of rain occurred.
I tried to find clues that could be dated using carbon-14. But, as I said, in this hyper-arid desert, the chances of finding a little piece of wood or a little shell are extremely small. And the big difficulty involved in the study of mud flows in this region is that we have a lot of trouble dating them.
The impossibility of dating the rains held back Luke's work for a long time. He had to turn towards other sources of historical information. Today, he is going to the newspaper El Mercurio to explore the archives, searching for articles on unusual weather. From being a geologist, Luke had to become a historian and patiently search through all the historical records available since the arrival of the Spanish on the continent.
Studying the press for the 20th century and historical archives confirms for us that rainfall episodes have always been extremely rare along the coast. Beyond the coast, in any case, it's an absolute desert, where it doesn't rain at all.
The study of historical archives brought some information about the last 500 years, but Luke is also working on much older periods of time. And since the Atacama held no clues to help him, Luke ended up by turning towards the sea.
So here we have two shells, slightly different in size. But we can find the first year of growth, the second, the third. Here's the first, the second, and the third, and it lived a little longer. This one is older and must be about 4 years old. In some cases, on some shells, there's a summer growth anomaly, which is much more marked. And this gives us the temperature anomalies which happen during the El Niño phenomenon. During El Niño, the temperature is 1 or 2 degrees higher.
El Niño is an exceptional climatic phenomenon which can modify all of the climate in the Pacific Ocean. It takes place when warm waters, usually off the coast of Australia, shift towards the coasts of South America, pushed by winds and currents. El Niño can also change the course of cyclones, cause droughts, lead to the disappearance of fish, or move zones of precipitation. This is what happens when it rains on the coast of Atacama. If today's shells carry the marks of these climatic accidents, it should be the same for older shells. So Luke asked himself what he could learn from shells that were thousands of years old.
So there we have shells comparable to those we find on the beach today, and other species, including this species in particular, which now lives in much colder water than there is currently at Antofagasta. During the deposit of these sediments and these shells, the water was much colder at this spot.
In this way, Luke managed patiently to recreate the past climates of the coast of the desert of Atacama. This also gave clues to the future of this desert in the context of global warming.
The El Niño phenomenon is tending to become more and more frequent, with greater and greater intensities. And this growth in the frequency of phenomena could increase even more with the effect of global warming. So there will be more and more heavy rains along the coast of the Atacama Desert. Not inland, but along the coasts.
This precipitation won't cross the first hills over the coast. Beyond that stretches out the vast plateau upon which it never rains. This is the central zone of the Atacama Desert. But the total absence of rain by itself doesn't explain such arid conditions. To pierce this mystery, Elizabeth Lichtevu and her team are seeking to quantify the dryness in different places around the desert. Using an evaporation dome, they are measuring the humidity of the air and the ground.
Here it's stabilized at around 21% relative humidity. The sun is going down. We don't have the same intensity, and there's more wind.
In fact, the desert of Atacama isn't that hot a desert. What's very important is the dryness of the air, the capacity of the atmosphere to effectively evaporate the water and absorb it.
The air of the Atacama is so dry that it dries out the soil to several meters depth, preventing dew from forming, as well as any other kind of humidity. But the evaporation dome reveals a surprising phenomenon.
So there we're seeing evaporation.
Yes, from the water table. The water table isn't deep here, approximately a meter down. So we have a little evaporation.
Although the first few meters of soil are totally dried out, the dome has shown there is subterranean water just below.
What's extraordinary here is that once past those first few meters, which are extremely dry, extremely arid, there's a subterranean water layer, an enormous reservoir of water.
The Atacama Desert is really the driest desert on the planet, but beneath its parched and lifeless surface are hidden vast subterranean layers of water, aquifers. Since it never rains directly on these layers, where does all this water which accumulates beneath the ground come from? And how much of it is available? To answer these questions, Luke accompanies the team of Rodrigo Riquelme, which is heading to the Cordillera of the Andes. The scientists especially want to know if the aquifers are formed by the water that falls on the Cordillera each winter.
Is the spring we're seeing here essentially fed by snow and rain? Where else could it come from?
Yes, well, here there is precipitation. We're at the start of the Cordillera.
What altitude are we at?
We're at 3,300 meters.
And there's precipitation.
There is precipitation, mainly in winter, more or less 200 millimeters a year.
With altitude, the climatic exception that surrounds the Atacama Desert no longer applies and rain falls again. The Andean summits capture clouds charged with water from the Amazonian basin. This is what is called an altiplanic winter. Thanks to this rain, the Andean altiplano is biologically richer than the Atacama Desert. Despite the altitude, lack of oxygen and glacial nights, plants and animals can find here a little water to survive and develop. Is this the water that feeds the desert of Atacama? Before answering, the scientists must analyze the spring.
This water that comes through here, where will it end up? Will it get to the sea?
I think the water infiltrates a little lower down. Since it's moving underground, we can't see it, but we can see the vegetation. The vegetation extends farther down.
But does the water go to the aquifer?
Yes, it goes into the aquifer. It feeds the aquifer.
Night approaches, and the team has to rapidly set up camp and prepare to bivouac at more than 3,000 meters with a temperature at around -20 Celsius. They won't be able to continue their work until the next day. It is becoming urgent to know more about the number, the size, and the functioning of these aquifers, because without these vast reserves, the whole economy of the country could plunge into chaos. For many years, the underground waters of the Atacama have been seized by an industry which creates the wealth of the country, an industry which uses a lot of water: mining. Even though its surface is poor, the desert of Atacama is full of different minerals: copper, gold, silver, and lithium. Mining is one of Chile's main resources, creating 15% of its GNP. An example of the gigantic scale, the mine of Chuquicamata, the largest open-cast copper mine. It operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Each truck, which carries the equivalent of 8 trailers of mineral, takes an hour and a half to reach the mine's summit. Employing 11,000 people, the mine contains copper reserves for at least 60 years more. The only problem is that the mine needs 100 liters of water every second. The water is used in the copper extraction process, but also to keep the dust on the ground. With mining, this hostile desert has also become the residence of hundreds of thousands of workers. The great coastal cities like Arica, Iquique, and Antofagasta have also seen their populations multiply by 5 over the last few years. The result is that towns move into the desert a little more every day, and the demand for water has exploded. Luc Ortlieb and Rodrigo Riquelme continue to follow the course of the water. What is the size and number of the aquifers? What are the real available subterranean reserves? To answer this, the scientists will have to decode the language of the landscape and read it as if it was a book. Rodrigo Riquelme is a specialist in geomorphology. By observing the nature of the rocks, the folds, the layers, and their porosity, he is attempting to deduce the structure beneath the ground, where the water continues its course and where it accumulates. An aquifer is created when an impermeable layer stops the course of the water. The water then accumulates in porous rocks, like in a sponge. But more than just the number and size of aquifers, Rodrigo's program is also trying to determine if the aquifers are connected or if they are separated. If there are passages between the aquifers, the rainwater will transit downstream, like a series of communicating basins. But if impermeable layers are blocking the water, it will mean that the deepest water will not regenerate. To better understand the structure and to detect impermeable rock, the team takes a number of ground samples.
And what are all these samples for?
It's mainly to see what salts are contained in the rock. It's the salts which allow us to determine if the water has the space to get through, and therefore to characterize this kind of rock as being an aquifer or not.
So I suppose that precipitation, rain and snow will recharge the aquifers that are topmost.
Precipitation will recharge the upper aquifers, but if you consider the melting and evaporation of snow, it's difficult to think that the deepest aquifers will be recharged by the snow. Beneath, it's probably fossil water. We don't know much about the aquifers, and I don't think that the mining companies are going to wait for us to find out more. They're going to carry on pumping this water.
It's a risky thing to do.
The mining industry uses water from the aquifers without knowing whether it is a renewable resource. In the central zone of the desert, some places are starting to show signs of fatigue. This is what's happening to the Salars, spaces made up of stagnant water and mineral salts. Luc goes with the team of Jorge Valdez to the Salar de la Mara. He hasn't been here for 20 years.
Very low.
It's impressive how low it is. I came here in 1993, and there were 2 or 3 meters more than there is now. It's really impressive to see how the level has fallen. There'll be nothing left in a few years.
No, it'll probably disappear entirely.
Roger Valdez and his team are working on the Salars of the Atacama Desert. Their objective today is to measure the drying up of the Salar de la Mara. The salars are characteristic of the desert of Atacama. They form when a subterranean water layer gets too close to the surface, the air and the sun. The water then evaporates, but leaves on the soil the many minerals it contains. A crust of salt forms slowly on the surface. At La Mara, evaporation leaves behind spherical rocks called stromatoliths, made up of a mixture of bacteria and gypsum. Jorge hopes to get information from them about the evolution of the salar.
Eso la marco y gira. Así. Para ver abajo. Okay. Aquí ya se ve la coloración, los distintos tonos. Verdes.
Here you can see green coloring, which is getting darker. Then at the center it becomes white. Here are the different strata, and by cutting them, we'll see if the strata repeat. Now we can see the coloring.
Yes, that's green.
A bit of yellow, brown.
What do you think you'll get from these stones?
We think the different coloring that can be observed reflects the changes that took place during their formation, such as in temperature or water level.
What period of time do you think this represents?
It's not very certain, but we think these stones are several decades old, a maximum of a century.
The drying up of a salar is a natural phenomenon, but the Salar de la Mara is drying up very quickly now. This worries Roger's team. Despite their very strong salinity, the salars are in fact environments where life can be found. Some species have adapted to this extreme environment, which is 10 times more salty than seawater. So the total drying up of this salar would mean the end of an oasis of life.
Does the change in the water level seem natural to you?
In this zone, and in particular for the Salar de la Mara, no. It's definitely not a natural variation. The salar has shrunk dramatically over the last 5 years, and even more so over the last 2 years, with a difference of a meter in water level. This means that the water is being extracted somewhere, and we think that here it's because of mining. There's a company extracting water directly from the salar. The great problem in our country is that water is private property. Because of that, individuals or businesses own the water, so they can do what they want with it.
In Chile, water is privately owned. Lifetime water rights were granted under the ultra-liberal dictatorship of Pinochet in the 1980s. This was done without real knowledge of the resource. Now, it is only possible to observe the falling level of many aquifers. And it's not just fragile ecosystems like the Salar de la Mara which are threatened. Some aquifers are used by the inhabitants for agriculture or just simple drinking water.
Here we have an enormous reservoir, the biggest aquifer in Chile. And from the measurements we've taken over the last few years, and the measurements of the last 2 years, we're seeing a general fall in the level of the aquifer. We made our reference level 0, and here we're dropping at a rate of 4.5 meters per minute. So it'll take a good 10 minutes to reach the water level.
In this place, you have to descend 53 meters to find water.
Everything all right for the speed, Fernando?
50?
54?
It's going up. In what units? Don't we have a scale?
No scale, no.
This here is the conductivity, and that's the temperature. The tendency towards a general fall in the level of the aquifer shows that the demand is greater than its capacity to recharge. So we're exploiting fossil water, which is non-renewable, because it took thousands of years to accumulate in this reservoir.
The penury of water is felt more and more by the desert villagers who take their water from the aquifers. In the little village of Tirana, tension reaches its heights during the festival of the Virgin Mary of Carmen in July. Each year, supplying water for the festival becomes more complicated. The religious festival brings together many troops from all over the country. They dance in traditional costume for 2 weeks, all day long, and they do this whatever the temperature. Manuel Sepulveda doesn't have time to join in. He's in charge of water distribution during the festivities.
This here is the part of the village of Tirana where the water comes out of a tap. But there are also trucks. On this map, you can see all of the planning and organization of water distribution. The trucks come from this sector with water, so they can deliver it.
The
problem with water at Tirana is that it doesn't get to everyone. Since here on the high plateau, it belongs to a company, and there's an area where it has jurisdiction over the water. So there's 1,000 people who live here all year long, but now there are over 200,000.
The festival lasts 3 weeks. The town authorities use 20 tankers to share out and deliver 5 million litres of water to the festival organisers, the dancers and the spectators struggling against the dust and heat.
Without water, there would be no festival. From that point of view, water is even more important than electricity or anything else. It's really impressive how all the services come into action. I think that if a lot of tourists come, they'll realize that here in the north, we're short of water. And with extreme conditions of heat by day and cold by night, it isn't easy.
The water in the tankers, like that of the aquifer, is tested regularly. Not only are there problems of quantity, but of quality as well. Aquifer water especially contains arsenic, natural pollution due to the volcanic rocks of the Andes, and, taking into account the rate of cancer and skin disease here, which is higher than elsewhere, this question is still very poorly studied.
Personally, I don't drink the water at my house or this water. I buy purified water to drink at home, and I only drink this water when I'm here. There are people who don't drink it and who will only buy bottled water. But there are people who are used to drinking this water, and some who get sick if they drink it.
Nowadays, there are more and more villages that are supplied by water tankers, and water is rationed for desert populations. Farms are being abandoned for lack of water or because of pollution from the mines. The Atacama Desert is today torn between the economic development of the region and the maintenance of local populations and traditional ways of life. Sabaya is a little village in the foothills of the Andes. Supplied by a spring, there are cattle and a lot of farming on terraces. But the dust sent out by the mines has already contaminated watercourses and the soil, decimating flocks and putting the lives of thousands of small farmers in the valley at risk. However, there continue to be many mining projects in the region. Haroldo Caceres is trying to unite the different villages of the Aymara community to fight together in this unequal combat.
The place we live in here is a desert. You've seen what the environment is like. The only vegetation to be found is what we ourselves plant. We were protecting our water because it's vital for us. If someone contaminates our water, or the supply drops. It's a terrible thing for us. I want people to understand that. We don't want to make money from our water or get some kind of economic benefit thanks to it. No, we just want to conserve it, so future generations can have the same things as us.
The village of Quillagua has already been in this situation. 15 years ago, major contamination changed the environment radically in an irreversible way. Quillagua is on the Loa River, the one and only river that crosses the Atacama Desert. Winding its way through the arid plains like a thin trickle of water, its course passes close by several mining sites, like the enormous complex of Chuquicamata. Margarita Cortez Rodriguez has seen the water quality of the Loa degrade and her village being transformed. Today, she is president of the Assembly of Quillagua residents.
Acá era todo esto solamente plantaciones de alfalfa.
There are lots of carob trees. Here, the carob trees that you can see are maintained and keep up a little vegetation. But it used to be lucerne, and now, where you're going, you'll see land like this, dried out land.
Y así está, pues ustedes a donde vayan van a encontrar esta tierra así, ¿ya? Esta tierra seca.
The Quillagua farmers can no longer irrigate their fields. The water of the Loa is too polluted to be used.
Entonces, eso contaminó las aguas.
The water was contaminated, and the farmers continued to use the water without knowing it had been contaminated. The animals started to die. There were a lot of sheep, pigs, and goats once. There were also cows and crayfish the size of lobsters, and all that died. We hope that one day life will come back to Quillagua by the river to feed us, because it was a source of food, corn, crayfish, and all the animals.
In the same way as at Tirana, the town authorities look after water distribution.
They bring us water 5 times a week. They bring it to us, and we look after it as if it was our baby. We don't take baths because it uses too much water. We use a 20-liter bucket to wash in. This is a desert, so really, if there was no productive interest to attract people here, such as the mining, the demand for water would stay very moderate, and the resources would be enough. We would be able to keep a natural balance between supply and demand, a balance which is gone today.
Scientists find themselves at the heart of this problem. While their role was already to understand the resources better, they are now trying to think up solutions so as to prevent the desert from drying out even further. Especially, they're looking for other sources of water supply. On the coast, nature has found a means of developing despite the absence of rain and underground water. When the humid ocean air meets the very dry air of the desert, a thick layer of cloud forms and encounters the first hills of the coast. This then produces a kind of thick fog, known locally as a camanchaca.
Here we are at Alto Patache, and it's very cold with very high humidity. You can feel it now. The clouds make the temperature drop, and the wind becomes humid, because at the same time the pressure drops. Because if the pressure drops, it allows the clouds to rise, and this generates the very strong wind that we can feel now.
Felipe Lobos is studying this very localized phenomenon. To quantify the amount of water carried by this fog, he collects it with the aid of a mesh. At the moment, he's come to collect the data taken over the last few weeks.
We are measuring the quantity of water captured by this device, which is called a cloud catcher. Cloud comes from the ocean, and little drops are caught here until they join together enough to form a normal-sized drop, which has enough weight to fall into the gutter. The mesh, as we can see, is wet. My hand is wet. The tube fills with water, and each drop falls here into the rain gauge, which sees drop by drop how much water is falling, and which this device allows us to measure. Normally, the clouds behave in distinct ways throughout the year. For example, in winter, as it is now in July in the southern hemisphere, there's a lot of fog. We can measure in one day between 30 and 60 liters per square meter, which means that this device can capture 30 liters of water in a day. In summer, there's a lot less, close to zero.
Even if it isn't a regular supply throughout the year, life can make use of this heaven-sent water. The camanchaca allows what are known as fog oases to form. At Alto Patache, there is biodiversity that is exceptional for the Atacama Desert. There are many species of lichens, plants, and insects. However, the ancient ecosystem is regressing after being exploited by local inhabitants for its wood and pasture. As nature fights here against disappearance, the Eulichnia cactus acts like a general in an army.
This is a cactus native to this place. It's called equiquensis, and it grows about 1 centimeter a year. That means that this one is about 200 years, maybe even 300 years old. This cactus is very important to this ecosystem because it acts like a water trap. With its long thorns, its runnels, and its branches, which join with its central structure, it can capture water like a stone. Water runs along the branches and directly down to the roots. And that permits other things to use the water. So it supplies a whole micro-ecosystem which is generated around the cactus.
This cactus had almost died out. They were used as firewood, as well as to build habitations or make utensils. Only the most difficult to get to remain standing. For several years, Felipe has taken part in a project to replant Eulichnia iquiquensis cacti to recreate the fog oases such as they once were. But as the cactus flowers only once every 15 years and there is only one pollinizing insect, scientists only managed to obtain a few viable seeds to launch their project.
The fruit opened and the seeds came out. We planted them in the laboratory under controlled conditions, and the plants began to grow. We waited 10 years as a precaution before planting the cactus here. Since the plant isn't yet mature and can't capture the fog by itself, we put it in this cage to protect it from predators, as well as this mesh to capture water. When the plant becomes mature, it'll do all that itself. In these places, which seem to be total deserts at first, there are plants which are unique on our planet. So it's very important to protect and maintain them, to conserve them, and in that way, reforest this ecosystem and recreate it.
Elizabeth Lichtervaux would like to go further and use these cloud-catching meshes to provide water for people. The Camanchaca is a potential resource of water, but before knowing what use it can be put to, it's important to know more about it.
We're putting up a cloud-catching mesh to study the water quality of the fog. The idea is to install cloud-catching meshes in places where we can collect enough water to get samples and then analyze them in the laboratory. We've chosen this spot because the vegetation shows it's a place where the fog concentrates, as this is a rootless plant, which moves about the hills and dunes according to whether or not there's fog.
The new mesh to study water quality is ready. Now it will take until tomorrow to see the first results and hope that the fog rises to this research site.
Look. That's very good. It really works well. This is nearly full. It's a really good place. That's great.
The amount collected is enough, but measurement must be taken to see what use can be made of this water.
Okay, 1,466 microsiemens per centimeter. Let's measure the pH now. Look, it's less than 5. The same as near the coast. We had 3. It's a little less acid than on the coast. Same problem, it still doesn't have the same pH as drinking water. That's right, it's a bit more acid than the limit. Drinking water must have a pH between 8.5 and 6.5, and on the coast there's water with a very acid pH, pH 3. Here the quality is a little better. We've got a pH close to 5, which is pretty acid, but more acceptable if you're thinking about other uses for the water. It can't effectively be a principal water source, but it could be water which serves to complete a water supply for a family or a small community. Household water for washing dishes, for example. But we're also looking at whether it can be used for agriculture, so it's important to study it to be sure about the quality.
The quality problems don't just concern mesh water. The management of wastewater is another major problem. When it goes back into the soil, it contaminates the water table and makes all the water unusable. Elizabeth's team are trying to filter this water using plants.
Hello, Leonardo.
Hello.
How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Is this the treated water?
No, it's still not finished. It needs a few more days. Water takes 7 days here, and this has only had 5. As you can see, it still has a color.
What's the quality of water like?
We've analyzed the water quality. If you can hand me the tray, I can explain it better for you. We made an analysis based on spectrophotometry, that is color. This, for example, is phosphate analysis. This is residual water without treatment, and this is treated water. As you can see, there's a clear difference in color. This is ammonia. Again, you can see the difference.
Wastewater and treated water.
That's right.
That's conclusive.
This totally natural technology seems promising. The plants feed by filtering the organic material found in wastewater. But the right plant has to be used.
This technology is used all over the world, and finding the optimal plant isn't simple, especially since it's complicated to adapt plants to the arid conditions of the Atacama Desert. We're trying out different kinds of plants. We're working with native varieties and also with plants from elsewhere. Using
the power of plants can be beneficial, and not just to filter wastewater. In the environment of the central zone of the desert, where the soil is just salt, a forest has found the means to grow despite everything you might expect. A very special kind of tree offers shelter and protection to other plants, animals, and human beings. Sergio Barraza, from the Chilean National Park Service, watches over the health of this fragile forest in the middle of the desert. He's going to a recent plantation where young trees are growing.
This tree is about 6 months old. We think it's nearly adapted to its environment. What's visible is a 40 to 60 centimeter high tree, and beneath there's a root which must be about a meter long. This tree gets compared to an iceberg a lot, because you can only really see a third of what's there. When this tree is 7 meters tall, its roots will be about 14 meters deep. And the roots will keep on searching for moisture until they find a source to feed from and survive.
The tamarugo's main priority is to pierce the crust of salt with its powerful roots. If it doesn't quickly make contact with moisture underground, it will die quickly from lack of water. But this tree has a number of other adaptations to life in the most arid desert in the world.
The leaves are small to reduce exposure as well as to reduce the transpiration of the plant. The thorns protect it from animals. This tree is well adapted to these difficult conditions.
The tamarugo has a last astonishing adaptation to fight the dry conditions. All plants have stomata on the surface of their leaves. While other plants use these openings to evacuate water, the tamarugo can use them the other way around, as a door to capture the air's humidity. This forest nearly disappeared in the last century. The wood was used to heat the steam engines of the nitrate mines. Many tamarugos had to be replanted, and the other 1,000 species that inhabit this forest had to be reintroduced. The tamarugo is the keystone of an entire ecosystem. The kilos of fruit they produce are a major energy source for neighboring species, as well as for humans.
The tamarugo provides forage for the herds: goats, sheep, bovines. In addition, with the fruit, flour can be made, and honey can be harvested. The shells are good for firewood, and the wood for building. At one point, it was difficult to get the community to participate in this project, but now they're happy. People are working with us and with the Chilean government so as to preserve this forest and help manage it.
Even in the middle of the driest desert in the world, humans can find a certain balance with nature once more. But wherever you are on the planet, life is always linked to the availability of water.
If there were no aquifers in this sector, with the underground water of the Tamarugal Pampa, none of this would be possible. It would be an absolute desert.
Through its extreme aridity, the Atacama Desert makes conflicts worse, showing the difficulty of managing and sharing the desert's water resources.
At this rate, probably within a decade, this salar will become a crust of salt, which is very sad because water is only found here. There are ecosystems and very special life in these zones which are found nowhere else on the planet.
These ecosystem relics, these little islands of life, are very important here because they fight against the desertification.
There's a big problem with water resources, which is limiting their use, essentially for little users, farmers, and which is really putting populations and long-term development of the region in danger.
But these difficulties are also making the Atacama Desert the laboratory of the future.
There are a lot of projects being developed because water is obviously a crucial problem.
All the knowledge we acquire here can be applied to other arid zones throughout the world and improve our knowledge of arid areas.
Protected throughout millions of years by its extreme aridity, the Atacama Desert has been disturbed in its long sleep by the increasing appetite of mankind. Does this recent disturbance announce the desert's end? Or on a geological scale, is it just a drop of water?